Hey, I'm Jack Hyber, and today we're taking a deep look at the most audacious, most consequential, and most strategically insane engineering project of the 21st century, China's artificial island fortress program in the South China Sea.
Welcome to Ultimate Megaprojects.
In 2013, this was open ocean. By 2016, it was a fully operational military base, complete with runways, missile systems, radar towers, and a deep-water harbor capable of docking aircraft carriers. China didn't capture this territory. They didn't invade it. They didn't negotiate for it. They built it. Out of thin air, out of sand, out of sheer, terrifying engineering will. Beat. $1 trillion, 3 years, 3 artificial islands, and a chokehold on the most important stretch of ocean on the planet. A waterway that carries $5 trillion worth of global trade every single year. This is not science fiction. This is not a future threat. This already happened. And the world, despite every legal ruling, every diplomatic protest, every U.S. Navy freedom of navigation patrol, was completely powerless to stop it. We're going to break down exactly how you build a military base on a reef that disappears at high tide. The engineering is mind-blowing, the scale is almost incomprehensible, and the geopolitical consequences are still unfolding right now, in 2026, in ways that affect every nation on Earth. We'll cover the dredging operation that moved literal mountains from the ocean floor, the construction methods that turned loose underwater sand into runways capable of landing 200-ton military aircraft, the hidden weapons systems buried beneath what looks like ordinary concrete, and the secrets, the environmental destruction, the legal violations, and the one engineering problem China still hasn't fully solved. This is the story of how sand became sovereignty. Let's get into it. To understand why China did this, you need to understand one body of water, the South China Sea. It connects the Pacific Ocean to the Indian Ocean. It is the jugular vein of global trade. Every year, ships carrying $5 trillion in goods, oil, electronics, food, raw materials pass through these waters. That's roughly 1/3 of all maritime trade on Earth. Whoever controls the South China Sea controls the economic bloodstream of Asia. And for decades, China watched as Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all staked overlapping claims to these waters, claims supported under international law by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. China had a different interpretation. Beijing claimed almost the entire sea as its own, a claim that international tribunals would later rule had absolutely no legal basis whatsoever. But here's what makes China's strategy genuinely unprecedented in modern history. Instead of fighting for territory, they created territory. Cut to early satellite imagery of fiery Cross Reef, barely visible above water. In 2013, fiery Cross Reef was a jagged coral formation, barely breaking the surface at low tide. A nothing, a geographical footnote. Today, it is a 2.8-kilometer military runway, a deep-water harbor, a radar installation with 400-mile range, buried missile silos, and housing for thousands of troops. The question is, how? Step 1 of this operation sounds almost childishly simple. Dig up the ocean floor, pump it onto a reef, repeat until you have an island. In reality, it is one of the most complex and logistically demanding engineering operations ever attempted. And China built an entirely new fleet of ships specifically to do it. Meet the cutter suction dredger. Think of it as a floating blender attached to a giant vacuum cleaner. At the front, a rotating cutter head studded with hardened steel teeth that tears apart the seabed, coral, rock, sediment, everything. Then a massive punk system sucks up the slurry, a mixture of water, sand, and pulverized coral, and forces it through a pipeline that can stretch for miles across the ocean's surface. At the destination, the reef, that slurry erupts from the pipeline like a fire hose, slowly, relentlessly building up a platform of new land above the waterline. China deployed over 60 of these vessels simultaneously. The largest, the Tianjing Hao, could process 4,500 cubic meters of material per hour. That's enough to fill an Olympic swimming pool every 30 minutes, running continuously, day and night, 7 days a week. In 18 months, China moved approximately 110 million cubic meters of material. That is more earth moved than was excavated for the entire Panama Canal. But raw sand dumped on a reef is not land. It's a disaster waiting to happen. Fresh dredge spoil is essentially a waterlogged slurry, unstable, weak, and completely vulnerable to wave action. The first serious typhoon would simply wash it all back into the sea. So before any construction could begin, China had to solve the fundamental engineering problem of making the land solid enough to build on. The solution was a two-stage process, and the engineering here is genuinely brilliant. Stage 1, the seawall. Before the interior could be stabilized, China needed to stop the ocean from reclaiming what they'd built. Engineers deployed massive prefabricated concrete caissons, hollow box-shaped structures weighing hundreds of tons each, placing them end-to-end around the perimeter of the new land, then filling them with dredged sand to anchor them permanently to the seabed. Think of it like building a bathtub first. You create the walls before you worry about what goes inside. Kilometer by kilometer, the fragile sand pile was encased in a continuous concrete barrier strong enough to withstand the full force of South China Sea typhoons. Stage 2, ground compaction. Once the perimeter was sealed, engineers began the painstaking process of squeezing the water out of the interior sand, a technique called vibrocompaction. Giant vibrating probes are driven deep into the sand at precise intervals, using controlled vibration to shake the water out of the spaces between sand particles, forcing them to pack tightly together. This process, repeated systematically across the entire island's surface, transforms loose underwater sludge into ground with sufficient load-bearing capacity to support heavy construction equipment, concrete structures, and eventually fully loaded military aircraft. Show before and after ground density visualization. The process took months of continuous work and constant soil testing. Get it wrong, and your runway cracks and sinks. Get it right, and you have the foundation for a military fortress. They got it right. With stable ground established, the real construction could begin. And the first, most critical priority was the runway. Not just any runway, a 3,000-meter military-grade runway, long enough and strong enough to handle any aircraft in China's entire arsenal, including its heaviest strategic bombers. Building a runway sounds straightforward. It is anything but. A military runway is a precisely engineered layer cake, from bottom to top: compacted subbase, drainage layer, aggregate base course, asphalt binder, and finally a reinforced concrete surface slab thick enough to absorb the impact loading of a 200-ton aircraft touching down at 150 miles per hour. Every layer has to be mixed to exact specifications, laid to precise thickness, and compacted to exact density. On land, this is a major engineering challenge. On a newly created artificial island in the middle of a typhoon-prone ocean, using materials that partly had to be manufactured on-site, it is an absolute engineering nightmare. China's solution to the material supply problem was audacious. They built concrete batching plants directly on the island itself, using the dredged coral sand as aggregate to produce their own concrete on site. This dramatically reduced their dependence on supply ships from the mainland, supply ships that would have been extraordinarily vulnerable to interdiction. The result? Show completed runway from above, perfectly straight, gleaming in tropical sun. A 3-kilometer runway built to tolerances of less than 1 centimeter deviation across its entire length, in the middle of the South China Sea in under a year. That is not just impressive engineering, that is a statement of intent to the entire world.
A runway is just the beginning. An airfield without defenses is just an expensive target. So, China built the defenses, and what they built reveals exactly what this project was always really about. Hardened aircraft shelters. These are not ordinary hangars. Each shelter is a reinforced concrete fortress within the
Welcome
fortress.
to Megabuilds, where we
Walls
explore the
thick
world's
enough to
ultimate
survive a
megaprojects.
direct strike
I'm your
from a
host, Jack
conventional
Fiber.
cruise missile.
Here, disputed
China
islands and
built
shipping
enough
lanes reveal a
shelters
web
on the
of
3 main
geopolitical
islands to
engineering
house
challenges.
full squadrons of
Spratly
J-10
Islands.
and J-11 fighter
Near the
jets,
Baltic Ocean,
protected
Challenger for
and
Central
ready to
Asia.
scramble within minutes.
This is where we find global
The
news
radar
from
dome.
power and reach are
Those
ubiquitous
distinctive white golf ball-shaped structures you see in satellite images, those are radomes, protective housings for sophisticated phased array radar systems. A single radome on fiery
artificial
Cross
islands,
Reef provides
they're not just
continuous
big,
360-degree
they're
tracking
massive,
of every
porous
ship and
geocrossable
aircraft
barriers,
within a
each one
400-mile
football,
radius.
seawalls,
That
footcraft
covers
carriers.
virtually the entire South China Sea simultaneously. The weapons. This is where it gets truly alarming. What looks from above like ordinary concrete
artificial
aprons and
islands in the
maintenance
South China
areas
Sea are
conceals
engineering marvels
something
of
far more
incomprehensible scale
dangerous.
and rivals aircraft
Vertical
carriers.
launch
But these
system
projects
silos
radiate
buried
geopolitical
beneath the
tensions,
surface,
with consequences
housing
unfolding by
HQ-9
2026.
surface-to-air missiles with a range of 125 miles and YJ-12 anti-ship missiles capable of hitting naval vessels 250 miles away. Combined, these systems create what military strategists call an anti-access area denial bubble, a zone over the entire South China Sea where operating a U.S. carrier strike group becomes genuinely, calculably lethal. That is not a construction project. That is a strategic revolution. Before these islands, China's naval reach from the mainland ended roughly 200 miles offshore. Their fleet needed bases, supply points, and air cover to project power further. Now, with this chain of island fortresses stretching 900 miles from the Chinese coast, they have permanent, unsinkable aircraft carriers in the heart of Southeast Asian waters. For the United States, which has guaranteed freedom of navigation in these waters since World War II, this represents the most significant challenge to American naval dominance in the Pacific since the Cold War. The U.S. 7th Fleet still conducts freedom of navigation patrols, but every patrol now operates under the coverage of Chinese radar, within range of Chinese missiles, watched from Chinese runways. Taiwan, which China claims as its own, sits 180 miles from these island bases. The Philippines, a U.S. treaty ally, has already seen Chinese Coast Guard vessels physically blocking its own ships from reaching its own territory. The strategic transformation is complete, and it was done with dredgers and concrete. Now, let's talk about what China doesn't want you to examine too closely: the environmental catastrophe. The coral reefs that China dredged and buried beneath these islands were not just geological features. They were among the most biodiverse marine ecosystems on Earth, irreplaceable habitats supporting hundreds of species of fish, coral, and marine life that millions of people across Southeast Asia depend on for food and livelihoods. Independent scientific surveys have concluded that China's island building program permanently destroyed approximately
Beijing
160
claims the South China
square
Sea,
kilometers
an
of
international
coral reef
tribunal rules
ecosystem.
no legal
The
basis
Philippine
whatsoever.
fishing communities who
The
fished
world is
these
watching
waters
this
for
tension
generations have been displaced. Their catches gone, their livelihoods destroyed, with zero compensation and zero acknowledgement from Beijing. The sinking problem. Here's the engineering secret China doesn't publicize. Artificial islands built on coral sand are sinking, slowly
continuously, measurably sinking, as the compressed sand beneath them gradually settles. Recent satellite analysis suggests the runways on Fiery Cross and Mischief Reef have subsided by measurable centimeters since construction, requiring ongoing maintenance and remediation. In a
Fiery
region
Cross
of
Reef,
rising sea levels and
colossal
intensifying
engineering feat,
typhoons,
pushed to
this is
hatch the
not a
seas.
trivial problem.
How did they build water to move?
The legal
Let's
fiction.
uncover them.
In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled unanimously that China's 9-line claim had no basis in international law and that the artificial islands created no legal maritime entitlement whatsoever. China's response? They declared the ruling null and void and continued construction. The world had no mechanism to enforce the ruling, and China knew it.
Behind the satellite imagery and the strategic analysis, there are human stories. There are the tens of thousands of Chinese construction workers, many of them young men from rural provinces, who spent months or years on these remote islands in punishing tropical heat and humidity, far from their families, building something their government told them was a matter of national destiny. There are the Filipino, Vietnamese, and Malaysian fishermen, families who fished these waters for generations, who now find their traditional fishing grounds inside a Chinese military exclusion zone, patrolled by armed Coast Guard vessels and told to leave. And there are the military personnel, Chinese sailors, airmen, and soldiers now stationed permanently on these islands, living in what is simultaneously a modern military facility and one of the most isolated postings on Earth, thousands of miles from the mainland in the middle of a contested sea. Every megaproject has a human cost. This one's human cost is measured not just in labor and sacrifice, but in sovereignty, livelihoods, and the daily reality of living under the shadow of someone else's fortress. So here's where we land. In less than 3 years, China transformed submerged reefs into permanent military fortresses, moving more earth than the Panama Canal, building runways to tolerances of less than a centimeter, and installing weapon systems that have fundamentally redrawn the strategic map of Asia. It is simultaneously one of the most impressive feats of engineering in modern history, and one of the most alarming demonstrations of how a sufficiently determined nation can use infrastructure as a weapon of geopolitical transformation. The international community protested, the courts ruled against it, the US Navy sails through it. None of it changed anything. So I'll leave you with this question. If China can build a military empire out of sand and concrete in international waters with no legal right, no international permission, and no consequence, what does that tell us about the rules that are supposed to govern our world? And what happens the next time a great power decides the rules simply don't apply to them?
If this breakdown changed how you think about what's happening in the Pacific, hit that like button. Subscribe to Ultimate Megaprojects because we cover the engineering stories that are actually shaping the world. Drop your thoughts below.
Every frame in this video has been crafted through a multi-stage documentary production process, from original research and script development to AI cinematic visualization and professional editing. Human creativity guides every step. A digital documentary host and advanced visual tools are used to clearly explain complex megaprojects, engineering, and global infrastructure. This channel is dedicated to original documentary storytelling and follows all YouTube policies regarding AI-assisted and synthetic media, ensuring the informative, unique, and monetization-friendly content.